All right, welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar with Unix Linux security expert and managing consultant at CyberEdge Group, Karen Scarfone. Top 5 tips for monitoring Unix and Linux privileged account use. You're also joined by Beyond Trust Systems Engineer Kyle Robinson, who will run us through a Beyond Trust overview and demo towards the end of the webinar, so please stick around for that. My name is Sarah, your webinar host today. A kind reminder to please submit your questions via the chat box in the GoToMeeting console anytime throughout the webinar, and we'll cover your questions at the end of the webinar during our Q&A time. Also, today's session is being recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to the recording and the slides shown here today within 2 business days from now. So at this point, let's hand it on over to Karen, who will jump right in. Hello, Karen. Welcome. I know you have a lot of content to cover today, so let's get started.
Hi. Great. Thanks, Sarah. Again, my name's Karen Scarfone. I'm a managing consultant with CyberEdge, and I'm going to be talking to you today about how you can improve your monitoring of the use of privileged accounts on your Unix and Linux hosts in your enterprise. Next slide, please. So who is this webinar for? Is this something that's going to help you? Odds are really good that yes, this webinar is for you. Really, it's you don't need a real in-depth knowledge of Unix and Linux to benefit from this. Really, it's intended for anybody who has any responsibilities related to securing Unix and Linux hosts in general, and user accounts specifically. If your organization has a large number of Unix and Linux user accounts that have privileges, this webinar definitely should help you to get a better grasp on how you can monitor what those accounts are doing and how those privileges are being used. And also, organizations that are threatened by attackers that use these accounts to move from host to host through your enterprise, this webinar will help you to find those attackers and to prevent those attacks from sort of slithering through your environment from server to server to get to some sort of ultimate target. That's not a new attack technique, but it's something that we're seeing a lot more often. And it's probably happened in your organization or will soon. Next slide, please. So who am I? Who am I to tell you these things? So I've been a Unix user since way back in 1989. I am a former sysadmin for several Unix and Linux systems, and I was also certified for several years by the SANS Institute in Unix Security Administration. My hands-on days in security and being a sysadmin are behind me. I now specialize in security publication development. So I'm not going to be here to teach you commands or talk about command syntax or get into the details of any particular Unix or Linux flavor. I'm here to give you education on Unix and Linux privilege management techniques and technologies. What is the state of the art? How can you make use of these techniques and technologies to get much better control over what your privileged accounts are being used for? So, I'm not going to get into any details specific to any one platform. Really, the techniques I'm talking about apply to all the flavors. Next slide, please. In this webinar, I'm really going to cover 5 topics. First, I really want to make it clear why monitoring the use of your privileged accounts on your Unix and Linux hosts is so important. It's important not only for improving incident detection and response capabilities in finding, those accounts being used in ways that they should not be used, but also in meeting security compliance requirements, whether it's PCI DSS or HIPAA or SOX or, the dozens, hundreds of different sets of compliance requirements out there. Pretty much all of them are going to require having the ability to monitor privileged account use. So monitoring those privileged accounts really serves two purposes. I'm also going to talk about the major challenges of monitoring privileged account use. If it wasn't challenging, the challenges are fairly profound. They're nothing new, but they definitely require taking a new approach and changing some of the ways that you do things, but for the better. I'm then going to present top 5 tips for improving the monitoring of your Unix and Linux privileged account use. And I'm going to explain how you can follow those tips and overcome all the challenges by implementing a Unix and Linux server privilege management platform. And as part of this talk, I will explain to you briefly what that platform is, how it works, the basic concepts behind it, so that you can understand how valuable just implementing this platform is for solving a wide range of problems. Next slide. There are several different risks posed by having privileged Unix and Linux accounts. In most situations, each account that has privileges, each privileged account, is usually incredibly powerful. In a lot of configurations, a lot of deployments, each of those privileged accounts has basically, a blank slate. It can be used to do pretty much anything on the Linux server or other host where it has those privileges. And a lot of times the same privileged account setup is used on many hosts. So if you have an ID and password that gives you full privileges on one host, you may have privileges on dozens of hosts or hundreds of hosts. So that single account, if an attacker got access to just that one ID and password, they could use it to just swing through your enterprise. They could compromise one host that's considered, unimportant and really isn't protected very well, and use that to jump to a second host, and then use credentials from the second host to jump to a third host. And by jumping through with privileges, an attacker can weave their way through to an ultimate target, like financial records, credit card information, medical records, intellectual property, any of those valuables that your organization really relies on and needs to safeguard at all costs. And the attacker can get to them and in many cases not be detected. The same holds true for malicious privileged insiders. As organizations continue to have more and more valuable information, there's all the more reason for a privileged insider to try to abuse those privileges and gain access to that information. So if you have somebody, say, who can get access to credit card information, maybe they would take that and transport it out of your organization and sell it. So, privileged insiders can definitely be just as much of a problem as external attackers. And part of the reason why this is so bad, not only that these accounts have all these privileges, but a lot of times they're not really monitored or audited closely, and sometimes not really monitored or audited at all. It's sort of assumed that the people using those accounts are trustworthy, and the people, if you have those kind of privileges, you can kind of circumvent monitoring and auditing, and also the accounts are shared, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but you can perform an action with a shared account and nobody may be able to figure out who of dozens or hundreds of people who might have had access to those credentials, which one was the one that actually, did the deed. So, there's just lots and lots of risk here. And, it requires having visibility into all the privileged account use all the time. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of different security compliance initiatives out there. that have requirements related to privileged account use monitoring. I mentioned before, there's this whole list of acronyms on here and many dozens or hundreds more that organizations in different geographic areas, in different sectors, have to comply with. But they all kind of boil down to some of the same requirements. They all pretty much require that organizations know who is accessing their sensitive systems and data. So if you have, say, medical records, need to know at any time who is able to access those medical records. These all require organizations to also be monitoring, logging, and auditing all of that access activity involving the sensitive systems and data. And they also all require that you be able to generate reports as needed on demand that document evidence that your organization is complying with the requirements. But really the most important part of that is the middle part. You need to have really robust monitoring, logging, and auditing, because that can tell you who was using their privileges on any Unix or Linux server at any given time, and which commands they issued or what other actions they issued, such as through a GUI interface, along with metadata. So timestamps, when did they issue the command? What command did they, what were the arguments to that command? There's a whole range of metadata that should be captured as well, so that you can truly say with confidence that you know what was done. Next slide, please. Now here's a few examples that get a little more detailed as to what some of these requirements are. Now, obviously, they don't have exactly the same requirements across these, all of these compliance initiatives. Some of these requirements are higher level, some are lower level, they're kind of all over the place. But if you sort of boil them down to their essence, these are three of the most common compliance requirements that relate to monitoring these accounts. The first one is the ability to log all attempted commands, whether those commands were accepted or rejected. And most noteworthy is that the expectation is that these be logged to the keystroke. So it's not just what command was issued, it is how was that command issued. Was it actually typed in by someone? How was it entered? Was it a script? You need to have a true detail as to how that took place. Really a look at the whole session, the administrative session. How did this actually occur? The second one on here is you need to be monitoring for possible intrusions and generate alerts or notifications as appropriate. That one's pretty straightforward. I mean, that's certainly a practice that you would expect any organization to be doing. It's just that a lot of times, we don't think about the privileged accounts and the fact that they have some special needs when it comes to monitoring to find intrusions or generating alerts. You might see commands issued with an administrative account that would not seem suspicious at all, but they certainly would coming from a standard user account. So it is a different sort of analysis that's needed, but certainly the use of those accounts really needs to be monitored because they're such an attractive target for attackers. And the final requirement on here is strongly authenticating each privileged user and restricting what they can do. Strictly speaking, that doesn't sound like monitoring, but it's actually critical to monitoring. Because if you're not able to strongly authenticate each user so that you truly know which person is using that privileged account at any time, then you do not have accountability. You cannot always, trace back and say, I know who this person was. I know who issued these commands. So if you don't have that strong authentication ability, your monitoring is really going to be watered down. You're not going to be capturing the additional information that you really should be capturing. And going along with this is all the access restriction. You know, if you only allow, if you can identify each person uniquely, then you can set just those few things that they absolutely need to do. And that makes monitoring easier because there's only a small set of things that they're able to do. And, you know, it allows you to look for attempts to do things that are outside of that authorized grouping of what's permitted. Next slide, please. So there's really 4 major challenges in monitoring the use of Unix and Linux privileged accounts. I've touched on some of these, but I'm going to go through all 4 quickly just to make sure that you have all 4 clearly laid out in front of you before we go through the rest. So the first one, use of shared accounts makes it difficult or in some cases impossible to determine who is using any account at a given time. You know, in some cases it's not so hard to figure out, but in a lot of cases it is. And even if you think that you know who was using that account, you may not really have a lot of confidence in that concept. You know, you might think that you know what happened, but maybe you don't really have enough confidence to, say, fire someone or to, you know, have police involvement in trying to, you know, recover something. So, you know, shared account really does make things a lot more difficult with monitoring. The second one, lack of detail. You know, if you don't have enough detail on the events being caused from privileged accounts, you know, you can't really tell what was performed during each session and even more importantly, what the results were. You know, it's one thing to know what actions were performed, but you certainly want to know what succeeded and what failed. What happened? What was the outcome? So having that kind of information readily available is definitely been a major challenge. The third one, people who have privileges are often able to tamper with auditing. You know, if you have full privileges on a system, you know, it may be trivial for you to delete logs or erase logs, to change audit settings and logging settings so that there's no record of anything malicious that you do. And there's really not a good way around that on a host level. You know, if people can just shut off monitoring whenever they want or alter it, that's a pretty big challenge. And the fourth bullet up here, you know, every host does its own logging. You know, in traditional sudo or sudo, as you prefer, type architectures, you know, each host is doing its own logging. And so you don't have a centralized single view of the privilege use across all your hosts. You have hundreds or maybe thousands of separate views for each host. And how do you monitor activity across all those hosts, especially if somebody is using one of those pivot type attacks to hop from host to host to host to slither through your organization? Yeah, there's really no good way that you're going to find that unless you can bring all of that together and have some sort of a centralized monitoring and analysis capability. Next slide, please. So as I started to mention sudo or sudo, other traditional privilege monitoring technologies and privilege management technologies really have some significant shortcomings. And I'll really use sudo as the example running through all of these. You know, these technologies are designed to be used on a single local host. They're not designed for enterprise-wide use. You know, just think about managing user IDs and credentials across hosts. Let's say that we have an admin named Bob. And Bob is responsible for doing some sysadmin work on 100 Unix and Linux hosts in your organization. How does Bob get access to these? Does he have an account and a same password on each of those 100 hosts? Does he have a different password on each of those 100 hosts? Either way, there's a big problem. You know, if you have the same password on all of them, if that gets compromised, then all those hosts are compromised. If you have a different password on everyone, how is Bob supposed to track 100 passwords and call those up when he needs them and rotate them regularly and do all the other things he needs to do to stay compliant with your policies and your external security compliance requirements? You know, it's a real nightmare. Another problem with sudo, you know, it's not going to log enough detail. You know, it's usually being used with syslog, and between the two of them, there's not much of an ability to log the details that you really need to understand what happened. In sudo type architectures, you know, each privileged account gets way too many privileges. So somebody who gets access to one of those accounts can do a lot of harm with just that one account. And there's no way to enforce principles like least privilege. There's no way to restrict people to just the privileges they need. And again, these security compliance initiatives and just general good security practices, you know, you really need to be doing things like least privilege. The final shortcoming is you don't have much visibility into and control over each host. So you don't have the kind of granularity that you would like to restrict what people are doing. But more importantly is the example at the end of the last bullet. You know, a lot of these technologies, you can't actually track what happens when somebody executes a script when they have privileges. You get a log that shows that the script was executed, but you don't have any record of what commands were in that script. So that's a pretty big shortcoming. You know, if you can't get access to that script after the fact, you have no idea what commands were issued. And that's just unacceptable from having, you know, a good picture of what's actually happening with the privilege use. Next slide, please. So the solution that's come up to replace sudo or augment sudo and syslog and these older technologies is generally known as a Unix and Linux server privilege management platform. This is a true enterprise-wide solution that allows you to manage and monitor and use privileges. The way that it works is that at its core has these authorization servers. And they basically sit between the people and the Unix and Linux systems. So when you want to use one of those servers, you don't contact the server directly. When you're using it with privileges, you don't contact the server directly and issue privileged commands. Instead, you connect to these authorization servers that are the privilege management platform. The platform verifies your identity, and once it is sure who you are, it has policies it applies that say which privileges you're allowed to use on each server. So you're simply authenticating yourself to this platform, and it is doing all the magic behind the scenes. You no longer, you know, Bob no longer has to have 100 passwords on 100 different hosts. He simply authenticates to that platform, and he actually doesn't even know what credentials are being used behind the scenes. That forces all users, privileged users, to have to go through the platform. The platform acts on behalf of them. And there may be additional requirements as well. You may restrict by time of day of the week, you know, what IP address or segment the person is coming from. You can put all sorts of restrictions on the users. By doing this, this platform gives you secure, centralized management and monitoring of all the Unix and Linux privilege use. Really, to summarize what the platform does, is it's limiting who can access privileged accounts. It's helping you to achieve compliance and reduce the risk of compromise. And the bonus is that these platforms are intended to have no negative impact on productivity. And in fact, in most cases, they actually increase productivity. Next slide, please. So these are the top 5 tips for monitoring your privileged account use. And the intent here is really that you would accomplish all of these largely through the privilege management platform. And I'm going to go through all 5 in detail on subsequent slides, but just to give you an idea of what the 5 tips are, I'm just going to talk through these very quickly. So the first one, you want to get rid of those shared accounts and strengthen authentication. So you're really confident that people are who they claim to be before they use any privileges. You're going to log all the details of how those privileged accounts are used. You're going to protect the audit logs from tampering by privileged users or by anyone else. You will achieve having a centralized capability for log review, looking at user sessions, and generating reports. And finally, ultimately, you're going to be able to monitor all these logs at all times for suspicious events and be triggered to respond when there's something that needs immediate investigation. Next slide, please. Tip 1, again, you want to eliminate shared accounts and strengthen authentication. And these may sound like 2 somewhat different things, but they really go very, very closely hand in hand. Now, issuing a unique account to each person is absolutely critical to meeting any of these compliance requirements. And it just opens up so much for you. It is no longer hard to trace who can access each account and what actions they've performed with it. It still supports those cases where you do need to preserve shared accounts. There may be a certain server where you have to use the root account to do certain things. And that works with this. You can still use the platform, and the platform can authenticate each person first, and then behind the scenes grant them access to the shared account. So even though the person's using a shared account, you know with great confidence who they are. Likewise, because you have these unique accounts, you can achieve least privilege and separation of duties and other important principles. You can restrict what is done with each account, what's possible. And that's something that you just cannot accomplish when you are using shared accounts that have full privileges. So as part of this, what you really want to do is implement multi-factor authentication. If you're just using passwords to get to all these admin accounts and all these privileges on all these servers, it's incredibly risky. Compromise of that password could have really dire consequences. The good news is that if you implement a privilege management platform, you can implement multi-factor authentication just at the platform level. Instead of having to have all of your Unix and Linux hosts each supporting multi-factor authentication, you can support it just at the platform level. And then again, magic happens behind the scenes, and you just have that one multi-factor authentication for your administrators to worry about. So that's a pretty easy and generally painless way, because they're just authenticating once to access many hosts. You can as well leverage any existing enterprise authentication services you have. Maybe you already have a multi-factor authentication solution. You can tap right into that. So anything like that, that it makes life easier for you in terms of account maintenance, is certainly workable. Next slide, please. Second tip, again, you've got to log all the details of how these privileged accounts are being used, what these accounts do. This includes monitoring and logging use of all commands, and not just what the command is, but also all the arguments that are provided to it. You need to also be looking at things like access or changes to sensitive system files, directories, and other objects. Those are all commonly affected by malware and attack tools, toolkits, and a variety of other types of attacks. So, finding changes or strange access to those is often a very early sign of an attack that's starting. Another thing that you really need to do for each event is log metadata. I gave a few examples of this earlier, but it's things like linking each event to the user ID that caused that event, or is relevant the user ID being affected by the event. You're recording the source host IP address if the user session is remote. Logging timestamps for when an event started, and if it has a duration, when it stopped or when it ended. And recording event outcomes if known, which is really helpful when it comes to incident response and mitigation, really understanding what an attacker was able to accomplish. Next slide. So the third tip is to protect your audit logs from tampering. Now, really, this is pretty difficult to accomplish on the individual hosts, but with a privilege management platform, that the individual hosts really aren't that important anymore because everything's going through that secure centralized platform. So you're actually recording all your audit logs for the privilege use on the platform. So if you have somebody with admin privileges who's deactivating logging on an individual host, you'll see that because you're going to see those commands passing through the platform. So, this also is very good if you have some sort of operational failures on individual hosts, or you have an attack that succeeds and wipes out logs. You have all these privileged records on the platform. Of course, it's really important that you tightly protect those centralized audit logs. If you take 100 administrators from your organization and you move their privileges onto the centralized platform so that they have all the privileges there, well, you've just moved the problem around. You really want to allow as few people as possible to have admin rights on the platform itself, which would include accessing logs, making sure that even those authorized people can't readily modify the platform logs, and certainly that if any modification, deletion, or erasure takes place, that it is logged itself and the appropriate people alerted to check it out. Next slide. So tip 4, you absolutely have to have a centralized capability to review logs, playback user sessions, and generate reports. By implementing a privilege management platform, you can have true centralized enterprise-wide Unix and Linux privilege use monitoring from one console. So if you, again, are an organization with a lot of Unix and Linux hosts, or even just a lot of accounts on a smaller number of hosts, this can be a real saver, having all this accessible in one place. Plus there's no manual log collection effort. It's not like you have to run scripts or manually log on to hundreds of different hosts and transfer things around. And, everything is just there for you. You don't have to work for it. It's just there. Another great capability of these platforms is recording privileged user sessions. It kind of works like a DVR. It's recording keystrokes, it's recording screens, so you have the whole picture as to what's happening. And then those handful of authorized platform administrators you have are able to play back those sessions, but of course with that playback logged and audited as well to make sure it's not abused. Another thing that platforms, should offer and typically do is set a built-in audit and compliance reports. And these reports should make it easy to generate evidence for all the different compliance initiatives that you need to meet. And if there are compliance initiatives that aren't in there, maybe something local or something, very specific to your organization, you can create new reports on demand as well. Next slide. Now the final tip, this is sort of the culmination of the other four. You get all these other things in place. You are then able to monitor your logs at all times for suspicious events and automatically trigger alerts when something is seen that merits investigation. So by doing this constant, 24/7 monitoring and analysis, the platform can find things that are suspicious. Whether it's a compromised account that an attacker is using or a malicious insider. You may even have an issue with a benign insider. You may have somebody who is not actually trying to do anything nefarious, but they're running the wrong command, they're running the command on the wrong host. People make a lot of mistakes. And by having a platform like this, you may prevent those things from happening, or you may be able to identify somebody doing the wrong thing in the wrong place very early on and stop before damage occurs. By alerting admins as soon as something, is serious is being seen, again, you can prevent incidents from occurring. You can also, if for incidents that do occur, make them shorter and reduce their impact, which is a huge benefit. Next slide. So to summarize what I've talked about here today, the traditional pseudo syslog type approaches to managing your organization's Unix and Linux privileges are just not sufficient anymore. You need to have a better approach so that you can meet all these security compliance requirements, and so you can, really fully support your incident detection and response capabilities. You need to be able to limit who can access these accounts, which will help you to achieve compliance and reduce the risk of compromise. And again, it may help you to not, to actually improve productivity. It streamlines a lot of things. It can save your administrators quite a bit of time while improving security too. And again, I have a little summary of the top 5 tips here. Got to eliminate shared accounts, strengthen authentication, log details, protect audit logs, have those centralized log review and reporting capabilities, and then by doing all that, you can do that around-the-clock monitoring and identify and respond very quickly to bad things that are happening. So at this point, I am going to turn things over to Kyle, who is going to present one of Beyond Trust solutions. So take it away, Kyle.
Thanks, Karen. I think I'm off mute now. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Hello, everybody. My name is Kyle Robinson. I'm a senior sales engineer with Beyond Trust, and we're going to briefly cover some of Beyond Trust's PAM solutions and how we can use those to meet the requirements that Karen's been speaking to. Next slide, please. So from a helicopter view, Beyond Trust provides solutions that basically fulfill all of the PAM solution areas that you generally hear analysts speak about, including the shared account password management with our password safe, doing password management for shared accounts, service accounts, session management for those types of accounts, so not necessarily exposing users to passwords, but still granting access, application to application, and application repository through API access to passwords. We have privilege management for Windows and for Mac and for Unix and Linux, which we'll be talking about primarily here a little bit further along. And really the ability to grant least privilege on those platforms, but still allow users to do the jobs that they need to do with the least amount of intrusion as they go through their workday, really granting the rights they need and nothing more, or at least providing a indelible audit trail of what it is that they accessed with each change control and those types of things. Vulnerability management, which really ties back to least privilege access control, especially when we're talking about risk involved in systems. We might want to make privilege access decisions based on the risk level of a system, which we could get out of vulnerability management solution. And bridge integration, which really is more of a simplification of identity management. If we're talking about Unix and Linux systems, generally they've been silos unto themselves, or they've used outdated and insecure protocols like NIST in order to facilitate user access. And we've got solutions there that will allow those systems to become true members of Active Directory and really simplify the overall identity management platform, and then extend that to privileged access so that roles can be established really in one location that can then trickle down to all of your systems instead of having to worry about provisioning and deprovisioning of those accounts and do an attestation in different systems and so on. Next slide, please. So PowerBooker for Unix and Linux. You can really think of this as sort of a sudo on steroids. The limitations you typically see with sudo, not having the centralized management, not having centralized auditing and collecting of events, it's all basically corrected with this product. It's an entirely different architecture, and it really brings a network-based privilege elevation architecture to what traditionally has been done with sudo. This allows us to get away from having too many privileges. If somebody needs full root access, once they're root, they can go ahead and modify whatever it is, whatever's collecting the audit logs, and block that, as Karen had discussed. And having this network topology in place really limits that, because we have that third party involved, where if the user is given root access locally, they're not necessarily root access in the system that's giving them that privilege. So of course, we're eliminating the shared passwords by requiring that users use this to gain access to root level access or any other shared accounts. They no longer need to know those passwords. We're auditing everything that happens in those environments while those users are performing privileged actions. And we can also do it for a restricted use scenario. It may even be less than least privilege, where you may want to audit everything. For example, if you have a jump box and you just want to see everything that goes through it, we can force that so that we collect everything at the user level. Now, it's not just command level control. It's truly system level control. We can dictate what commands the user is allowed to execute, but we can also look deeper when a user executes a script, or if they try to access a specific file. Even if we've given out root rights, we can still prevent that user from, for example, modifying the shadow file where the passwords reside, or executing a shutdown in the middle of the day on a production server, because we can actually block their ability to get to those commands or even get to those specific files. Next slide, please. Now, how does it work? So as I mentioned a little bit before, this is really a network-based model. So all of your Unix and Linux systems will have be considered the client here. And when a user submits a command that they'd like to run with privilege, it's going to go off to a policy server and logging servers, and of course it's highly available, so you can have multiple and you can spread it out against multiple different data centers. These policy servers are going to consult the central policy, which is going to determine if the user is allowed to run the command or not. But not only if they're allowed to run it or not, but also if they need any additional information to provide. So multi-factor definitely comes into play here, exactly as Karen mentioned. If we really need to validate this user is who they say they are beyond simple username and password, we can require that they provide a token, and we can validate that at the policy server level, and it may even be command specific. So on some servers, some commands may be allowed without any additional re-authentication or multi-factor, but for others, if they're critical, we can require that. We can require a reason, or we can require a ticket number, so that we can track those events end to end to make sure that the change controls that were in place, you could actually verify and audit what the users did. Once the policy server establishes that this is allowed to be run or rejected, it's going to, of course, log an event. These events, while done at the policy server, can also be forwarded off to other SIEM products. So you can pull those events in and use those for your own reporting outside of the product, but of course we also provide our own reporting. Once the policy server determines if it should be recorded, some commands, we don't care about if it's a simple hostname command where they're not setting the hostname, or something that's not interactive, we don't necessarily need to record, but you can make the determination within the policy what should be recorded and what's just an event. and those, of course, those sessions are recorded in a way that you can search through them as well. And then all of this information also trickles up to our Beyond Insight platform, which all of the products that were discussed on the previous slide, they all provide their information into that same platform so that we can use this for analytics and reporting across the entire breadth of everything privileged access management, including doing some detailed risk analysis of baseline behavior analytics and those types of things. Next slide, please. Now, advanced control and audit, this is really getting below the level of the individual commands. So you may grant the user the ability to run a specific script, for example, and that script may have hundreds of commands within it, accessing thousands of different files. With advanced control and audit, this is where we're going far above and beyond what Sudo and other similar solutions are providing by actually following along with the different system-level functions executions as different files are read for write, for link, for execute. And we can watch everything that's happening within those commands or within those scripts, and you have the ability to either just audit or block different things that are happening there based on that policy. So even if a user somehow modifies that script to make it malicious, if you know the area that they're potentially trying to edit or that they may potentially try to edit that you want to block off, maybe it's just a database that has financial data or healthcare data in it, you can do that. Next slide, please. Of course, what good is all this data without reporting? So we're collecting all of this and then providing you very granular reports, a searchable index, the ability to customize these reports and schedule reports. So if I've got 5 critical servers and I'm a Unix admin and I need to see what happened on those servers every morning first thing, I just want my report, I can go and schedule that report, get it by email or by file copy. Of course, this is also great for the auditors because they want to know, well, who had access to this server these days? Not necessarily who accessed it, but who was it? And that can change from day to day. So if we schedule these reports, copy them to a file server, and we'll have them available that when the auditors come asking, we've got the information to give them based on the day that they may have potentially needed to know who had access. But as an admin, I'll be able to see who it was who accessed my server, what commands they ran, and then of course the ability to go back through and actually more of a forensics level walk through step by step everything that they did on that system, playing through it keystroke by keystroke. Next slide. All right, which brings us to the product demonstration. So give me just a moment here. I will go ahead and share out my lab. Let me just get a quick check and make sure that this is showing up. Is my lab system showing up? All right,
you're
great.
all good.
So just as a brief demonstration of some of these capabilities, I'm logged into a Unix system with 2 different users here. I've got Sam and I've got Amy. Actually, I think you guys can see through the control panel here. But a very basic example. Typically, a user is going to be running sudo and some type of command that they'd like to elevate. We have the same capability. We can wrap the command or we can manage sudo itself, but we also have this network-based model where we're going to be running the pbrun command in order to provide the elevation. Now, I've included a little bit of additional output for demonstration purposes, but basically we're getting elevation exactly as you would expect for the sudo command. So to an end user, it can more or less be transparent, the same kind of things that they're used to doing today. They can migrate over. This is really just here to tell us that the server is involved and which server is accepting the command and who it's being executed as. In this case, for a command that's so simple, our policy doesn't really care much about receiving the full I/O of what happened in this command. But for something that's more advanced, like running a shell, we definitely want to capture the I/O logs for that. We want to know everything that happened while this user was root because we're really giving them access to everything on this host. So once again, once more for demonstration purposes, we can see where that log's going on the logging server, which policy server accepted the command and who we were running it as, which you could also request a different user at the command line if you'd like to. But at this point, I'm essentially a full-blown root user. I can do anything that root can do, almost. So this is where advanced control and auditing comes in. Of course, we noted that it's being recorded, so we can look at that a little bit later here. But we're also still in control. We're still in play here, even though we've given this user root access. As an example, if I tried to edit the shadow file, we'll basically deny that. We don't want root to be able to change other users' passwords or to potentially change the password of the root account to bypass our system. So we could block that. Another example is to try to shut down the system, as I mentioned earlier. In the middle of the day, it's not something we want this user to do. Even though they're root and they can edit everything else, explicit things we could block, and it wouldn't matter if this was being called through a script or anywhere else, it's still going to deny this access. Now, from an auditing perspective, Amy is an auditor in this configuration. So if Amy wants to take a look at any of the recordings, simply can run a command from the command line here, or we could use a web interface. This is a very Unix-centric product if you want it to be, but of course there are web capabilities if you're not as comfortable with the command line. But you really can think of this as sort of a DVR of exactly what a user has done from the command line, and we can walk through things character by character. We can walk through line by line. We can go forward and backward through the inputs. We might have a recording that's several hours long. Maybe we want to know the specific time that one command was run, versus another command. We can basically get all this output. If I hit H key here to get the help output, you'll see the different options that are available within this, including things like searching by regular expression or searching by timestamps. So it's an extremely powerful tool, and it really gives us an entire forensics trail of everything that the user did. Now, more and more often we're seeing vendor type use cases come up where you need a tighter view of what vendors are doing while they're logged into your systems, or even just contractors or lower level admins. With this configuration, you can actually do an over the shoulder view of what's happening in the environment. So you could, for example, configure the policy to trigger an alert that the user of a certain level is accessing a system. You get that alert, that email. You could go and log in, find their recording, basically, which could also be a part of the alert, the path to the recording or the command to view the recording. And then once you hook onto that, if you go to the very end of it, it's like a Unix tail. It follows along with what that user is doing, including things like going into an interactive shell. So we're really getting that full audit of absolutely everything that happened on those Unix systems, as we want to, or to the level that we desire. And with that, I believe I will turn it back to Sarah for the closing out of this.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay, so let me go ahead and re-show my screen just to that last. There we go. You guys should see my screen now. Okay, so we're going to jump into questions, but let's go ahead and do our last poll here, you guys. I saw a bunch of questions come in, so please submit them right now, and we will jump into Q&A. But you should see a poll pop up on your screen at this point. And here at BeyondTrust, we'd love to help you guys with your privileged access and vulnerability management needs. Would you be interested in engaging with one of our security experts further? We can either chat with you about our solutions, suite of products, or even walk you through a more thorough one-on-one demo of PowerBroker for Unix Linux or any of our other PowerBroker PAM solutions, or even Retina. So let us know, select yes. I'm going to leave this up and let's jump right into questions. I received a bunch, so let me go ahead and jump in. Karen, this came in for you. Is logging all command attempts down to the keystroke a requirement of ISO 27001?
I don't know that off the top of my head, unfortunately.
Okay, no problem. We'll get back to you, Fred, on that. Karen, how do you recommend capturing full text commands in logs?
Really, if you use a platform that takes care of that for you, I mean, a privilege management platform, you don't need to worry about how these things are being stored. The platform takes care of all of that behind the scenes, and you could just access things depending on how things were entered. Like if it's keystroke type commands, now things are searchable as well. So the platform can do a lot more for you than you just trying to sort of manually record things and pull things out of the logs.
When you leverage existing authentication services, does this include Kerberos?
Sure, it could.
For you, Kyle, who decides what privileges admins have? Is there a super user admin or a super admin?
There is, yeah. So really we need to restrict it down so that users can't escape the level of access that they've been given. So at some point someone needs to dictate the policy file itself. So on another host where we have more constrained controls, that's exactly where that would happen.
Okay, Kyle, let's see. We use sudo today. Is there a migration option from sudo to PowerBroker for Unix?
There is. There's great migration options. So we can make it as transparent to the end users as possible. We can move to two different models. One that's just strictly centralized sudo with some of the additional capabilities like keystroke logging, but still leveraging sudo in general as infrastructure. And then another that goes away from sudo entirely that provides some additional nice functionality like remote command execution and almost sort of a cluster type behavior for high availability.
Okay, we have time for one more question for you, Kyle. What controls are in PowerBroker for Unix and Linux to stop someone tampering with the logs, especially if they have been elevated to root?
So the logging happens instantaneously to a remote log server. So while the user has root locally, they won't have it on the remote log server. So we're always getting that. If the user goes through the process of trying to shut down networking or anything to that level, then we'll basically sever their connection to their root access.
All right. I did receive a couple of questions asking about the slides. If you look at the GoToMeeting console right now, you guys should see a section called Handouts. And in that section will be the PowerPoint slides that were shown here today in PDF format. So you can download that directly from GoToWebinar right now if you'd like. Or you will be receiving a follow-up email from our email alias communications@beyondtrust.com. It will include a link to the slides and a link to the recording. And that will be delivered to your inbox within 2 business days from now. So be on the lookout for that. You should receive it by Monday at the latest. So with that, a huge thanks to our speakers. Thank you, Karen and Kyle. And to all who attended live today, we really appreciate you guys asking questions, being interactive, and joining us live today. So everybody have a wonderful rest of your day and your week, and take care. Goodbye, everybody.